Enemies leave their weapons behind for one night as they band together in brotherhood and forget about the brutalities of war. The men fighting in the Great War took a stand against their superiors in the war itself, resulting in an action of civil companionship amongst the men in Christmas 1914. Not only did the event exchange handshakes and time with each other, it also shows the soldiers in the world that there is more to war than killing, but friendships can arise from conflict. The First World War was one of the bloodiest wars in history and ended up with over 16 million dead and 20 million wounded all over the world, civilians and all. Many of the European nations had tangled relationships with one another, which led to complicated alliances. On the 28th of June, a Serbian assassin murdered Archduke Franz Ferdinand, which gave the war-hungry nation of Austro-Hungary backing to invade Serbia. 30 days later, Austro-Hungary declared war on their southern Slavic neighbor, Serbia, which did not come as a huge surprise to most Europeans. Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany swore to the Austro-Hungarians that Germany would support their decisions against Serbia. Tsar Nicholas II of the Russian Empire also promised they would support Serbia in any conflict against foreign powers. All of these world leaders were aware that this would lead to a large conflict in Europe, but Austro-Hungary's Emperor Franz Joseph I and his generals could not hold back from Serbia. After the invasion of Serbia, the Russian Empire, Germany, Belgium, France, Britain, and many other countries fell into the war effort. All countries had strong propaganda against their enemies, which boosted morale and nationalism amongst the people. Millions of countrymen were eager to fight for their country and defend their way of life. Germany's expansion through Belgium into France was a mobile war, fought like previous wars, but after Germany was pushed back from Paris and France, this all changed. Germany began to dig in northern France, which was seen as dishonorable by the French, but honor did not exist in this new type of warfare. After months of constant bombardments and the rains told with endless mud, the Central Powers, which consisted of Germany, Austro-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and Bulgaria, and then the Allies, the United Kingdom, France, Belgium, Russian Empire, Serbia, Italy, Greece, Portugal, and Albania, found themselves at a stalemate. Victories did not exist anymore, only long drawn-out waiting, and constant shelling which created miles among miles of torn ground. What used to be farmland was now fields of muddy holes, debris, fallen men, and networks of trench lines. These trenches were the only source for cover due to constant artillery fire and retaliations from the enemy. These trenches started from small holes in the ground to entire networks, which created nearly unbreakable lines for each side. Winter started to fall in for the men on the front, which made conditions on the Western Front even worse than they already were. There was small talk amongst the soldiers and civilians of a temporary ceasefire for the upcoming holiday of Christmas, on some or maybe even all fronts of the war. Even though sides had different ideologies, languages, and governments, many were still influenced by Western cultures and ideas. Though the Catholic Church had split up many countries, many soldiers still identified as Christians to some degree. Pope Benedict XV tried to work with the fighting powers for a truce, saying the guns may fall silent at least upon the night the angels sang. His efforts were ignored by both sides, and Britain's Horace Smith-Dorrien specifically instructed them to stay away from any kind of ceasefires for Christmas. Any kind of attempts at a ceasefire truce would be met with strong punishment, which made the odds of a Christmas truce slim. Most of the previous talk of a truce were crumbled. Morale fell low again on the front. The ordinary infantrymen on the front began to think of their enemies in a new way, instead of the usual stereotypical view. The soldiers' trench lines were sometimes just dozens of yards away from each other, so they could make types with contact. In some sections of the Western Front near Ypres, they had small ceasefires to temporarily collect their dead comrades in no man's land. These were not usually long-lasting, nor were these ceasefires common because high ranks frowned upon the idea of comradeship with the enemy. On Christmas Eve, the 24th of December, the soldiers prepared themselves for the holiday. German soldiers collected small trees and placed small lights in their trench lines. British soldiers received small tin packages from the Crown that had chocolates and tobacco. The day had a hard frost which made it slightly more bearable than the days before. As night fell, singing could be heard from the German trench lines.
It's white, beautiful moonlight, frost on the ground, almost white everywhere. And round about, I think about 7 or 8 in the evening, we heard this singing, a lot of commotion, and we saw some lights. I don't know what they were, some lights. And later, we heard them singing, Still a Silent Night. still a night, silent night. I shall never forget it. It's one of the highlights of my life, absolutely, to see them. I thought, what a beautiful tune.
We must retaliate in some way, so we replied with the First Noel, and when we finished that, they all began clapping. Then they struck up another favourite carol of theirs, O Tannenbaum, which is the same tune as the Red Flag. And so we went on. First the Germans singing one of their carols, then we'd sing another of ours.
That morning, something spectacular happened. Soldiers on both sides began to rise from their trenches and met in the center of no man's land.
A couple of chaps met in no man's land and shook hands and turned round and waved, and we all cheered, and then we flocked out like a football crowd, sort of, running as fast as we could. It was very broken ground, and people fell into shell holes and things, but still we all got into the middle eventually, and we began to shake hands, and then we began to swap things like cigarettes and cigars and chocolate.
In some sections, German soldiers left their trenches first, and others the British did. The soldiers shook hands with their adversaries, exchanged rum, chocolate, and many other small gifts. On one occasion, the Germans and the British had a small football match, which resulted in a German victory 3-2. On another occasion, a German soldier did a small show in no man's land, juggling. In other places, the soldiers simply spent the day socializing and celebrating the day. As the day came to an end, the soldiers made their way back to their trench lines. In some places in the front, the truce did not last very long due to artillery fire from both sides. Since the event happened in such large numbers, it was hard to punish the battalions that took part. Most of the soldiers ended up continuing to fight against who they called for one day friends. As time went on, so did the war's atrocities. The truce itself gave soldiers a sense of humanization and hope during the war. In return, soldiers started humanizing the enemy, thus causing conflict amongst generals like Horace Smith-Dorrien. As a consequence of the ceasefire, less fighting took place in the sections of the Western Front where the truces took place, at least until the beginning of the new year. After the unofficial Christmas truce, the ceasefire inspired many other ceasefires. Some of the truces were reality, and some were just imaginary, as the commanders did not allow for a ceasefire or fraternization with the enemy. In November of 1915, a Saxon unit briefly met with a group of men from the Liverpool Battalion, but mostly just to collect dead bodies. A month later, nearing the Christmas of 1915, the officers and commanders made certain that the Christmas truce of 1914 would not become another conflict by raising disciplinary actions. Waving white flags, the Russian soldiers attempted a ceasefire with the Austro-Hungarian troops on 1916 of Easter Sunday, but the ceasefire was turned down by the Austro-Hungarian troops, thus causing one of the last attempted ceasefires of the First World War. During the months of December 1916 and 17, the French would exchange gifts and sing within their trenches themselves. As World War I came to an end, the Christmas truce of 1914 was almost forgotten because of all the other horrors in the Great War, and only 21 years later, the Second World War began. The ceasefires in the Second World War were not as common, but there was a small period of time where the shooting ceased in the Hurtgen forest, so that way wounded men could make their way back to their own lines. For many years, the truce was not made public until a British broadcasting documentary in 1981 came out due to historians not looking into the event that took place, although much information was stored in diaries and journals of soldiers. The truce also showed that there is a time of humanity and a time of complete inhumanity, which showed that peace is possible by taking a stand against generals and other people involved. Even though General Smith-Dorrien realized there were going to be ceasefires, he tried to raise disciplinary actions in order to prevent further truces after the truce of 1914 had occurred. In addition to General Dorrien, more disciplinary behavior was increased, but holidays were celebrated within soldiers themselves. In commemoration, there have been songs, plays, books, and many other sources used to recreate or just simply tell the story of the Christmas truce. Aside from books and plays, there have also been statues put in place representing the truce. Prince Charles of England unveiled a statue with a soccer ball to represent the soccer tournament that took place in no man's land. The truce affected the lives of the soldiers more than anything, but it would later impact the rest of the world. With World War I being one of the most bloodiest wars in history, came depression, hatred, and a time of crisis. The Christmas truce was able to show society's tranquility, peace, and hope during the war by taking a stand, building friendships, and ultimately the celebration of Christmas.